Vyacheslav Maltsev is joining our broadcast, the chairman of the National Committee for the Fight Against Putin. Vyacheslav, hello. We're glad to see you. Let's not only fight against Putin, but also tackle the disinformation, which is now so widespread on YouTube. Many people are saying that the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping was a completely equal one. Supposedly in Alaska, Putin bargained for himself some kind of different, higher status. But then you read other analyses, and they say that Xi Jinping didn't even wait for Putin for the joint photo. What do you think about the outcome of their personal meeting? Was it, after all, a meeting of a child with their parent, so to speak? Or has Putin really become an equal player in the game?
You know, let's just look at the event that took place over the last 2 days. That is, on August 31st and September 1st. And this is a truly epoch-making event. And Putin actually has nothing to do with it, right? Even fools now understand that the world has a new leader. Even fools now realize that China has become the world's leader, and there is no longer any US hegemony, nor will there ever be again. And attempts at secretly controlling the world have been replaced by open governance. That is, no one is even trying to hide it anymore. And when Xi Jinping, announced global governance, what was he talking about, right? It's absolutely clear that he was talking about a world government, one that Europeans definitely won't be part of, and Americans definitely won't get into. I mean, maybe Europeans will gradually join in, but Americans will remain isolated. This is what we've been warning about, and I personally have been saying for the last 25 years. But everyone thought we were fools and that it was the ravings of a madman. And now the result will be absolutely obvious. That is, with each passing day, I want to emphasize with each day, the role of the United States will become smaller, smaller, and smaller. Of course, China is not going to go to war with the United States. America is still the most powerful military force for now, but that's all. If we talk about the merging of all these entities that met, I mean the countries that gathered in China on August 31st and September war. They are much stronger than the United States, and unlike America, which is stagnating, they are developing. That's why now we see what has happened. A terrible thing has happened. Well, first of all, or rather, this is actually the second point. First of all, China is, of course, the undisputed leader. Secondly, China managed to secure the support of its main rival, the one who really could have stopped China, who is developing just as rapidly as China and has a very similar potential. I'm talking about India, right? The Prime Minister of India came to China and embraced Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping stated that it's time for the Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant to become friends, and that these are the two most civilized countries, and that they are the most populous, yes. And immediately one recalls the ideology promoted by various Schwabs who strive to create a golden billion, who aim for the Earth's population to be 600,000 and so on. And the question arises, they seem to completely deny dialectics, deny the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. If they deny it, then they're idiots. But if they know that only quantity can turn into quality, then they're traitors. They've betrayed their countries. They've destroyed them. They've pretended to rule the world without attracting the attention of the orderlies, yes. And as a result, their secret management of the world has turned into China's overt control. Putin is only involved to a certain extent. He's just a backup dancer. China needs him, or rather needs Russia as food, right? Because China, of course, has already swallowed Russia and is digesting it. We've talked about this many times. And Putin is also needed by China as an icebreaker to scare everyone and maybe, if necessary, to start a war in Europe or even a nuclear war. That is, China would stay on the sidelines while Putin would be the one firing nuclear weapons at America and Europe. This fits perfectly within this plan. Besides everything else, Putin is the one who can sign the START 4 treaty, since, as I understand it, START 3 has ceased to exist. This is about the limitation of strategic offensive arms. So America and Russia will limit their strategic offensive weapons, while China won't limit anything. The Tianjin Declaration has been signed. What is this declaration about? It's about what we've been talking about. Yes, in other words, the aspiration for a so-called multipolar world and fair governance for regional and global security. What does regional security mean? It means that Putin won't attack the Baltics if Xi Jinping doesn't want him to. And global security means that China and those aligned with it must be much stronger than America, Europe, and the NATO countries. So this is also anti-bloc rhetoric. What do you mean by anti-bloc? Against the NATO bloc, right? And also the need to reform the UN. We've talked about this too, and Guterres was there. Why was he there? Well, because it's very advantageous for China right now to draw the UN to its side. They already have a majority in this organization, and I think they could easily move it from New York to Shanghai. Because in America, not everyone who wants or needs to speak at the UN is given a visa. For example, right now the Palestinians went, but they weren't given visas. And that's probably why it makes sense to move it to Shanghai. That will be the rhetoric, and then they'll give the UN certain decisive powers. Since China will have the majority, they can use the UN to pressure everyone, claiming that it's the decision of the world government, the decision of the entire world, and spouting all sorts of other nonsense. Basically, Xi Jinping did exactly what we warned about, and he did it in the most, I would say, masterful way, the kind that Zotia wrote about in Hagakure. And by the way, Xi Jinping has read that book since he refers to these things, albeit indirectly. In other words, he quotes it, but not explicitly. Yamamoto Tsunetomo, the author of Hagakure, also wrote that you should first win, then fight. This is an Asian principle. China has already won. If anyone thinks that China rushed into a fight with the Americans, nothing of the sort. They have already won. And you will realize this very soon. Trump will understand this too. As soon as he arrives at the summit in South Korea, the government is pretty soft. They'll be wagging their tails for everyone, for Trump, for Kim Jong-un, for Xi Jinping. And generally speaking, the future looks quite unpleasant because Trump is pushing Europe away from himself. He will most likely be president for another 3 years. So this nightmare will go on for 3 years, and after that it'll simply be impossible to catch up. But we've said before that no one would have caught up anyway. Even if Kamala Harris were in charge, she wouldn't have caught up either. In other words, the setbacks that have happened have been building up for 50 years. For 50 years, the United States and China have been gaining momentum. They've been building it up for 50 years. Why are they doing this? Because it's financially beneficial for them, right? So this is exactly the situation where they get cheap goods, make enormous profits by manufacturing their iPhones in China and so on. And what's happening, as I've already said, is exactly what Marx talked about, then Lenin, then Mao Zedong, and later Xi Jinping repeatedly echoed. In other words, the capitalists are selling the rope on which they will be hanged. That's a quote, a full quote from Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Xi Jinping. If the capitalists don't know this, then they are complete idiots, right? In other words, they have brought their world to a state where it has reached, so to speak, a barrier, the final line. That is, capitalism is at its last limit. It's in its terminal stage. They refuse to understand this. They try to prolong their agony instead of stepping into the new era that China has entered, which is called cyber realism. This is a new socio-economic formation, and it's obvious because the means of production have changed. That means it's time to change the relations of production, but those have remained capitalist as well. And the mode of production has become distorted. Not capitalist and not something new, but distorted. Well, you remember what happened when it became distorted during the feudal era, right? That is, some guys came in wearing long pants, and those with short pants had their heads cut off with an object called the guillotine. Basically, the same thing is about to happen again, only on a more global scale. And it's absolutely clear that Putin here is playing more of a secondary background role. It is, of course, very advantageous for Xi Jinping in particular for the war to continue in the region where Russia and Ukraine are located, for Putin to remain aggressive, for Europe to be afraid, so that Europe negotiates with Xi Jinping, asking him to rein in Putin. In fact, Putin is acting as an icebreaker for Xi Jinping. So everything is going according to plan. For now, he is fulfilling the role assigned to him. And I think that going forward, the vast majority of those in power in Russia will continue to act under China's influence. They submitted to China a long time ago. They have signed every agreement that was required. Notice that there isn't a single mayor, not a single governor, not a single head of a ministry department who hasn't traveled to China and met with some high-ranking official. And what was happening there? China is a communist state, actually fascist, but officially considered communist. And what happens in communist states? There, you have to sign agreements on cooperation. And that's it. I'm absolutely convinced, I would bet anything on it, that all Russian political figures who are currently in power and haven't yet been pushed aside have already traveled to China and signed the relevant documents long ago. Look, this isn't even about Putin. And I always use this example. He flew to China, went into Xi Jinping's office at noon, and by 1 o'clock his plane was already flying back to Russia. So why did he rush in there? To kiss the hand and sign the cooperation agreement that the Chinese security services gave him.
Vyacheslav, in conclusion, I want to ask you something. Please tell me, what exactly is Trump planning to do about this? He says that he will carefully consider the possibility of imposing sanctions against Russia. Although, to be fair, it was Bessent, the US Secretary of the Treasury, who said this. But still, does Trump have any tools to stop or slow down this process, which I'm sure neither you nor I are happy about? And perhaps you'll correct me, maybe there are some advantages to living under China's rule, under its hegemony. But here in Ukraine, we don't see any so far. What methods of resistance are there?
There are no advantages at all to living under China's rule. And I've been warning everyone for a long time, I was called an idiot for it, that Chinese hegemony will change, will drastically change the world. China is now in a new socio-economic formation, cyber realism in the form of cyber tyranny. And China will export this cyber tyranny all over the world. The whole world will exist under a form of cyber tyranny. In other words, there can be no talk of any freedom at all. And things will be very bad, much worse than under Putin, right? Or even under anyone else for that matter. And it will all end very badly. But that's a topic for another conversation because China does not know what it is doing. But what will Trump do? Trump has already acted. He met in Alaska and got everything he wanted. He's pleased and practically jumping for joy and said he gave Putin another 2 weeks. But after those 2 weeks, he gave another 2 weeks, and now those have ended probably a week, maybe two ago. And now he doesn't say anything else and seems to have stopped communicating. He's disappeared on this matter. They say he's dead, right? And even Vance declared that he's ready to take power into his own hands. But there's an opponent there. Well, obviously, if Trump dies, the vice president would automatically take over. But then Trump's son is also asking for the position, right? So that's the kind of thing going on there, right? From one election to the next. That's why it's quite difficult to compete with China, where everything about power is absolutely clear. And I think that right now Trump has two options. Well, he could go to the summit in South Korea and voice some of his grievances, or he could listen to flattering words about himself, that he's the greatest, that he's God's chosen one, that under his leadership, America has flourished unimaginably. Well, and maybe receive some gifts in the form of airplanes, right? Or, airplane-like gifts like the ones he got from Qatar. Yeah, by the way, he's not the only one. Erdogan before him got those Severin-style boots, like in the green van, the kind that no one can refuse. And that's it. And he'll come back satisfied, telling everyone that he returned victorious. Obviously, no Chinese troops are going to march into New York tomorrow. So you can confidently talk about the victory of the United States and how wonderful everything is in the world. But nothing in the world can actually be wonderful for the simple reason, let me emphasize again, that the United States will remain in complete, utter isolation. And Trump is really helping to make that happen. As you can see, agreements have been signed with India, or at least China has reached some understandings. Then why were these agreements reached? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Well, the current Prime Minister of India is currently facing a significant number of very serious problems indeed. Modi is a yogi, yes. But unlike other yogis, he doesn't like problems and deals with them in a completely different way. So Trump claims that he stopped the war between Pakistan and India. I think it was China that did that. That is, initially they set Pakistan against India and then later stopped them. And many other problems that Modi faces are resolved as soon as he reaches an agreement with China. Understand that in India's economy, there are the United States. That's 13% of goods and services that India exports and less than 3% that they import. So Indonesia is about the same, around 3%, right? Well, or about 3. So Trump is issuing some ultimatums while being on the same level as Indonesia. It's just ridiculous. That's why, of course, Modi made a deal with China, and this will continue. And since India is, so to speak, at a lower stage of development, China will undoubtedly dominate and dominate very seriously. And India won't be able to break away from it anymore.
Let's hope that some kind of black swan will appear. Maybe with some American or Ukrainian flag, we'll see, and the whole situation will turn around because, well, it's just not acceptable. I say no to all of this. But your analysis, of course, deserves attention because, well, as they say, they've brought it to this point. Vyacheslav, thank you again. Yes.
I can argue with you that nothing can be changed. And regarding Yanukovych, I'd like to say one more thing.
If possible, please keep it under a minute. Go ahead.
Yes, that when Trump meets with Zelensky, Trump will insist on holding elections by the end of the year. I think that was Putin's condition for elections in Ukraine. I think now they're going to push hard in that direction. That's why Yanukovych has reappeared, and many others have come back to life as well. Thank you very much. Long live the revolution. Death to tyrants. Power to the people. Goodbye. Best of luck.
Thank you so much, Vyacheslav. All the best. Vyacheslav Maltsev, chairman of the National Committee for the Fight Against Putin, was on air with Ukraine today. Stay healthy.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to heroes.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.